Hello everybody. Today, I'll be sharing my experience keeping Pogonomyrmex badius, commonly referred to as the Florida harvester ant. In this video, we'll go through my full journal from catching the lone queen all the way into the hundreds of workers they've grown into. But before that, I also want to cover some key background information on this species, as well as a basic care guide, both to introduce badius more fully and to help anyone interested in keeping them themselves. Just for a bit of structure, here's how the video will be organized. First, I'll cover some basic information. Understanding the foundation of any ant species is crucial to keeping them in captivity. After that, I'll go over a straightforward care guide: temperature, humidity, diet, those sorts of things. Finally, I'll walk through my personal journal of keeping this species thus far. All of the chapters are sectioned below, so feel free to skip around. Let's start with the basic info. Pogonomyrmex badius, which I'll just call badius from here on, is native to the southeastern United States. They're found mostly in Florida, but their range stretches as far north as North Carolina and as west as the Mississippi River. This region, as you may know, can get pretty hot and humid. Summer temperatures can reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity stays high being close to the ocean. On top of that, their nests are built in a way that absorbs and holds heat, being spread out over large, sunny areas. As for the ants themselves, they're a vibrant red and covered in fine hairs. Beneath their mandibles, a dense clump of these hairs exists called a semaphore, a feature found in most Pogonomyrmex species. You can see it being used here, almost like a basket to clump up sand for transport. The last unique trait I'll cover, and probably the most interesting, is their polymorphism. Because of the isolation from their west coast relatives, badius evolved a polymorphic worker caste, something entirely unique to any other North American Pogonomyrmex. This adaptation resulted directly from their diet, where collected seeds are used as a significant food source. Majors are especially helpful in breaking these seeds down for the rest of the colony. After being opened, the seed core is milled down to a sort of paste, which ant keepers often refer to as bread. This is the edible food you'll often see larvae and sometimes even your queen eating inside the nest. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'll leave it there for now. Those are the most important. Next, I'll go over the essentials for keeping this species in captivity. Now, let's get into caring for badius. The most important thing to get right, regardless of their setup, is temperature and humidity. These ants need it hot and humid to thrive, more so than other Pogonomyrmex species. For temperature, a hot spot of around 93 Fahrenheit works best in my experience. Offer this with a heat gradient of a lower temperature, like 85 Fahrenheit. That way, the ants can thermoregulate themselves to their preferred temperature. As for humidity, keep it as high as possible without flooding their nest. Above 80% seems to work, but don't chase that value specifically. Just offer as high as you're able to. Now, let's talk about diets. Harvester ants, as the name implies, gather many different foods from around the nest. For badius, this includes mostly seeds and insects, but sometimes sugars, or even small mollusks like snails in the wild. While they're capable of eating a wide variety of foods, you really only need to provide two things in captivity: seeds and insect protein. In my experience, they will grow faster when offered more insects, and they see seeds as a sort of backup food. So I try to keep their seed storage full in the nest and offer insect proteins nearly every day. Their favorite seeds seem to be chia and crushed hemp, but they aren't picky. I've also had success with thistle, sand lovegrass, dandelion, and Kentucky bluegrass. Finally, I'll talk about the nest setup you should aim for. From founding to 15 workers, badius seem to do best in a test tube. To reach the desired heat and humidity, keep them in an incubator set to 93 Fahrenheit. Also, be sure to add some media along the bottom of the test tube, as they have a terrible grip on slick surfaces like plastic or glass. Once above 15 workers, they should be ready for a nest. So here's a short checklist to go over when you're choosing one. First, choose a nest with direct hydration, rather than a water tower. Direct hydration encourages higher humidity, which by now you should know badius love. Second, make sure the interior is sand-coated, or at least not slick. Again, badius have terrible grip. Avoid acrylic or other plastics at all costs. Third, multiple nest chambers is ideal. This way, you can heat one more than another, fulfilling a heat gradient. However, chambers are more of a luxury than a necessity. You'll see that in the journal, mine are without separate chambers for a decent portion of their life and grow just fine. Those are all of my nest tips. None are necessarily required, but I wanted to share the checklist I went over when deciding. So with that out of the way, let's get into what you probably clicked on this video for in the first place, the journal. As all journals should start, we begin by catching our queen. Badius have their biggest flights in June and July, but you'll sometimes see smaller ones in late May or early August. There are 3 main indicators that a flight is likely: recent heavy rain, ideally within the last 3 days, warm temperatures of above 85 Fahrenheit, and low wind, usually under 8 miles per hour. If all of these conditions are met, check your local Badius mound at around 10 a.m., and you may be met with a sight like this. Males from nearby colonies will gather at the edge of a nest and attempt to mate with queens, all while under a swarm of protective workers. After mating, the queens usually head back inside. The following few days, they'll re-emerge between noon and 4 p.m., where they'll begin digging their founding chambers nearby. The founding chambers themselves are quite conspicuous, often dug in bright, sandy clearings. Here, search for the semicircular sand piles nearby their entrance, notably with chunky clumps of sand at the peak. These large clumps are a telltale sign of Badius queens, and are thanks to their semaphore I mentioned earlier. When you manage to find an active founding chamber, this is the time I'd recommend you catch them, as they're almost always dilated and ready to lay eggs. Simply wait for the queen to come up and close the entrance behind her, then collect her in your tube. After that, I put her into the test tube setup, then the incubator. And now we wait. 5 days later and we have a good clump of eggs, but don't be mistaken, the majority of these eggs won't make it to workers, being trophic. If you're unfamiliar, trophic eggs are basically just infertile, made solely to be eaten. Regardless, we will continue waiting for larvae. Another 5 days of waiting and our first few eggs have hatched. While Badius are technically fully claustral, I'd highly recommend feeding them proteins once they get larvae. Otherwise, she will sacrifice most of the brood to a couple larvae, minimizing the possible worker count coming out of founding. A couple fruit flies, or in this case a bit of mealworm, should be plenty. 6 more days and our larvae have really eaten away at the mealworm. With that food, they've begun pupating, which you can tell by the whitish hue in some of the larvae's bodies. In a few more days, the pupating larvae should start developing their structure a bit more, so we'll check back then. Another 4 days and you can see the larvae have fully pupated now, with a segmented body, head, and legs. I also offered some Kentucky bluegrass seeds during this time, though I don't think she was too keen on them. Now into mid-July, our pupae is just about ready to a close. You can tell this pupae is a bit more colored than the others, meaning its exoskeleton is in the process of hardening, the last step in development. It should only be a few more days now until a worker appears. And just like that, 2 days later we have our first worker. You can tell she practically just eclosed, as she's still super unsteady on her feet. So let's give them a little time before feeding. A few more days and they've exploded with growth. To reward them, I've given some liquid sugar. I mentioned before that sugar isn't necessary, but they do seem to love it regardless. And then disaster struck. 5 days later, completely out of the blue, the queen had died. This isn't incredibly unusual for Badius. Queens tend to suddenly die when colonies are small. But still, it was quite a setback. As to not let the brood go to waste, I gathered it up and boosted a similarly sized colony, which was eager to accept it. To help feed this new brood, I offered them a piece of cricket. The queen immediately jumped into defense mode, with workers soon coming to help her. One of the workers even chews off a leg to bring back to the brood pile. 10 days later, and now into August, you can see their tube has changed quite a bit, with a big sand ceiling they've constructed. It kind of sucks for visibility, so I decided I'd go ahead and move them into a nest. The nest I chose is pretty typical of what I'd usually use, except for the walls inside the nest, which I decided to also coat with plaster. I did this to make the inside of the nest smaller, hopefully making the colony feel more secure, but also to increase humidity by increasing surface area of the plaster. So with the nest made, all that was left to do is move them in. Here they are around a week after being moved. I didn't want to mess with them too much, as the first nest move for Badius seems to jeopardize them. So I just gave them a bunch of seeds, and you can see they've put them to great use, feeding loads of new larvae. Funnily enough, they also put a singular larvae in the seed pile, not sure why. Another week and the colony is progressing extremely well. All the larvae have now begun pupating and a lot of the old pupae have closed. There's also a great pile of eggs on the peak of the pile, which shows our queen feels just as comfortable. We can really confirm this with her movement around the nest as well. In the old tube setup, she didn't have much of a choice apart from standing still. But now, she's zooming all around, enjoying her newfound space. The next day, I wanted to do a fruit fly feeding, which is by far their favorite food to eat. So I dropped some in and set it on time lapse. Inside the nest was a mess, with fruit flies scattered all over the floor, but our larvae and queen loved all the food. Now at the very end of August, we have a surprise in the nest. Do you see it? That's right, our first major larvae. Hopefully nothing happens to this guy while it develops. Other than the major, the rest of our brood is still looking great. Literally one day later, and the major has begun pupating. Shouldn't be too long now until it becomes a proper pupae, then it closes into a worker. Another 5 days and the nest is getting pretty dirty. If you decide to keep this species yourself, you'll realize how tough it is to keep them clean, especially when they're bigger, which I'll show later. Our major has now also become a true pupae. You can see here our brood is still doing wonderful, and not only that, but our major has started to color up, which means it's almost done pupating. To give them that final boost, I fed a bit more proteins and left them alone. And on the 19th of September, we've gotten our first major. Just for an idea, I caught these queens on June 22nd, so 88 days from lone queen to getting their first major, which doesn't seem too bad. At this point, their nest is getting pretty full, so we might have to make an addition soon. The brood pile is still excellent with no signs of slowing down, and even has another major on the way. Nearly a full month later, and they're really getting packed inside the nest, so we're going to have to add another module. But before that, just look how crazy these guys are for liquid sugars. It's pretty funny, and again, sugars are entirely unnecessary for badius, but still, it's really entertaining to watch. But yeah, the nest addition is pretty straightforward thanks to the side port. And voila, just like that, our colony has 2 times the space. Now into November, the colony is definitely starting to slow down a bit. In retrospect, I probably should have diapaused them at this time rather than waiting forever, but hindsight is 2020. Either way, our major has finally started doing its job and is processing most of the colony's food, which is pretty cool to watch. Our queen is also doing great, though noticeably laying less eggs. It is what it is though, she deserves a break. At this point, I found some termites outside and figured I'd live feed them to the colony. If you don't want to watch, you can skip ahead to the next chapter, but honestly, it's just termites being bitten and pooping in response, it's nothing too gruesome. And if you think I'm kidding, I mean you can literally see that one just pooped. But anyways, if you didn't know, ants and termites have been evolutionary rivals for most of Earth's history, so if you ever find a colony of termites outside and you can snag a few workers, your colony of ants will probably love to eat them. Now this is something I want to draw attention to, so I'm going to go on a short tangent. Some northern badius will need to diapause. Long story short, I didn't know this, as I had gotten most of my info from southern keepers whose badius doesn't diapause. So for anyone who plans to keep a northern queen in the future, here are 2 diapause indicators to look out for. First, your colony may start eating their brood. For whatever reason, badius doesn't show the normal signs of diapause, like brood pausing development, queen laying no eggs, or other things. Rather, they will actively limit the amount of growing brood by eating it. If you ever see something like this, where a bunch of workers begin over-tending to a singular brood, it usually means they're about to eat it. And if this is happening regularly, they may want to diapause. The second thing is the queen laying less eggs. Note that I don't mean 0 eggs like other species might do, but instead 25 to 50% of what she used to lay. As you saw earlier in the journal, this colony was doing spectacular. Badius queens lay a lot of eggs in optimal conditions, so if your colony is seemingly doing amazing, then suddenly the queen slows her egg rate, it might also be a sign. Unfortunately, both of these signs can be caused by other conditions unrelated to diapause, which is why it took me so long to realize the issue. But I hope this oopsie from me can be your flash of insight if something like this were to happen to you. Anyway, let's continue with the journal. At this point in their growth, they filled both of the small nests comfortably, and so I figured it was time for another upgrade. Rather than adding a third small nest module, I decided on moving them entirely to a single, big nest. And of course, to go with it, a larger outworld. I was pretty excited to use these new containers and see the colony in them, so I wasted no time in construction. Here's how it came out. Pretty nice, huh? I was hoping this single large block of plaster would hold much more water than the two smaller nests. And can't forget the outworld. This guy though needed some escape prevention. And just like that, their new setup was ready, so let's move them in. This time though, wasn't as simple as connecting the new nest and leaving them be. I wanted to get the whole colony to move, and if you keep ants, you know this can be pretty tricky. I decided I'd move them one nest at a time, placing the old nest in the new outworld and taking off the lid. Still though, even with the nest lid off, they didn't want to leave, so I put some gloves on and dumped them out. And again with the second nest. This one though had the queen, so I couldn't miss the opportunity to say hi. Then immediately shoved her down the new nest entrance. And here they are fully moved in, looking pretty cozy. As a welcoming gift, they got a chunky cricket, which they delimbed and brought inside. Then, I guess our queen was overdue for a bath, because they cleaned her non-stop for at least 10 minutes. Even her teeth. Afterwards though, she was very happy. Look at that face. Now finally at this point, I had figured out the diapause issue, in that they just wouldn't grow much past this until they got sleep. So, the next day, I went ahead and put them in the fridge at 50 Fahrenheit. 39 days later, and they came right back out. After heating up for a few hours, they became incredibly active, which was a great sign. I knew they were going to explode going into their second year, so a few days later, I added an anticipatory secondary nest module. A 2-week wait later, and everything was going smoothly. Tons of new eggs were being laid every day, and some had even hatched and begun eating as larvae. Late April, and the majority of eggs had hatched into a beautiful pile of larvae. And I mean truly, if you enjoy ant keeping, a sight like this is so satisfying to see. If you're curious why they're so colorful, it's mostly due to those fruit flies you can see them eating. When they eat fruit flies, they'll also inevitably eat some of their eyes, which are full of an incredibly rich red pigment. Each larvae eating different amounts of that red leads to different colors manifesting in their stomachs, which is why some are super red, others are yellow, and some are not colored at all. Super cool. A few days later, and pretty much all of those larvae had begun pupating. Our queen is looking excellent, and if you're curious, still loves running around the nest in her free time. She's still laying heaps of eggs every day, so there's really no sign of growth slowing. Now into May, and I thought I'd show you these. Baddies tend to make these balls of larvae I like to call larvae balls. You can see one here. I'd imagine the workers clump eggs together based on when they're laid, so that when they hatch, they're already grouped up and easy to move. Every other ant I've kept just throws all the eggs into a single big pile, so this behavior is pretty clever of them. Besides that, there's a pretty huge pile of brood in the center of their nest now, which is cool. And I cannot stress enough how much they love fruit flies. May 15th now, and pretty much the entire back half of that nest is filled with pupae, which is just an insane sight to see. As for the second nest, they've now just begun putting some brood into it as well, probably because they consider that first nest full. But there's something more important that I haven't shown you yet, arguably the most exciting for this entire journal. Can you guess? A male elate. If you keep ants, you know that getting a reproductive elate is one of the most meaningful milestones, as it officially marks the colony's transition into maturity. And honestly, this caught me by total surprise. It's safe to say I wasn't expecting an elate for a very long while. But either way, it's here now, so I'll enjoy it. On a not so happy note, this is where I'm gonna wrap up both the journal and the video. This colony became really high maintenance to keep clean and happy, to the point where the outworld needed a full clean every week, or they'd literally climb their poop up the walls and escape into my room. At that point, I just couldn't keep these guys any longer. That said, Pogonomyrmex badius has easily been the most enjoyable ant species I've kept thus far, and raising this colony to maturity, if we count it, was an awesome experience. I also hope this encourages some of you who may be considering this species to give it a shot. You won't regret it. That is, unless they die at founding.